Welcome to today's webinar, The Comprehensive Plan, Sustainable, Resilient, and Equitable Communities for the 21st Century, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your ASCP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is the Comprehensive Plan, Sustainable, Resilient, and Equitable Communities for the 21st Century. You can also search for event number 923-1260. So our speakers today are David Rouse and Rocky Piro. David Rouse is an urban planner and landscape architect with more than 40 years of experience, focused on creating healthy, resilient, and sustainable communities. He is committed to connecting professional practice and research to develop practical solutions for 21st century planning and design issues. David served as research director for the American Planning Association in Washington, D.C., where he worked closely with nonprofit and federal partners to advance planning practice on topics such as hazards planning and resilience, community health, and planning for autonomous vehicles. Prior to joining APA, he was a principal at Wallace, Robertson Todd in Philadelphia, where he led many of the firm's major planning projects. Rocky Piro is Executive Director of the Colorado Center for Sustainable Urbanism at the University of Colorado, Denver. He also serves as Associate Professor in the College of Architecture and Planning. Previously, he was the Manager for Planning and Community Development in Denver and Program Manager for Growth Management at the Puget Sound Regional Council in Seattle. He is a member of the Board of Directors for the International Urban Planning and Environment Association and past chair for the Regional and Intergovernmental Planning Division of the American Planning Association. Rocky attended Valparaiso University in Indiana, the University of Colorado, Denver, and the University of Washington, where he earned a doctorate in urban planning and design. He received the Meyer-Wolf Award for Excellence in Planning in 2010, and both of our speakers today are members of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Certified Planners. Following their presentation, David and Rocky will answer as many questions as time permits. As always, you can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And to get started today, as we usually do, we're going to launch a poll to just ask where everybody in the audience is from. So please respond to this. If you're having trouble, you may need to exit from full screen mode to choose one of the 5 options here: West, Midwest, South, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, or International. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. We'll have a very large crowd with us. So we'll give you a few seconds to respond to that, and then we'll show you the answer and turn it over to our speakers. And again, also thanks for participating in this. Always interesting to see where people are from in the audience. I'll give you a couple more seconds. Excellent. So today, 36% of the audience says they're in the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast. 23% in the South, 19% in the West, 17% in the Midwest, and 5% of the audience is outside the US today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Rouse. Welcome, David. You're going to need to unmute, David.
Good point. Thank
Okay.
you, Michael. And I presume everyone sees my screen?
Yes, you just need to go into full screen mode.
Oh, it isn't in full screen mode? Looks that way to me.
There you
Bear
go.
with me. Is it in full screen mode now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. There's always the inevitable glitches at the beginning of a webinar like this. But in any event, thanks again, Michael. And thanks to the Maryland Department of Planning and to the Smart Growth Network for giving us this opportunity. And most of all, thanks to all of you in the audience, I'm sure Rocky agrees, who've taken the time out of your busy schedules to spend the next hour and a half with us. So hopefully it's going to be worth your while. Let's see. Let me try this again. Okay, now can you see my second slide? Presumably
Yes.
you can. Okay,
Yes.
good. This will work from here on. So Rocky and I would also like to thank Taylor and Francis and Routledge Press for agreeing to publish the new book that's the subject of this webinar. So first things first, on the slide you see a link to Routledge's webpage for the book and the code you can use to get a 20% discount. And the link is will be provided in a PDF, which I believe Michael will make available following the webinar. And also, as we go through our presentation, you'll see a series of links to comprehensive plans and other resources we cite. So in case you're interested and like to follow up and look at any of these, you can access them through the PDF. So here's what we're going to cover today. First, I'm going to speak about why this book is needed now, give some background on APA's Sustaining Places initiative, which was the genesis of the book, and then highlight some of its key features. Then Rocky will start, and I'm going to finish a whirlwind tour of the contents of the book. And I'll conclude by ending with some thoughts about the future of the comprehensive plan, where it's going, taken from the book's concluding chapter. And I think we will have plenty of time, hopefully, left at the end for questions and discussion. So why is this book needed now? We're all familiar with 21st century challenges like technological change, socioeconomic inequality, climate change, and environmental degradation. The news seems to get worse and worse every day around these and other issues. And the conventional comprehensive planning model, which is what old timers like Rocky and I grew up with in planning practice, just are inadequate to meet these challenges. So we need a new model of comprehensive planning. And there is a new model that's emerging in the 21st century, one that's not addressed really by the current comprehensive planning literature. And Rocky and I saw this when we were talking about doing this book. And what we tried to do was address that gap and develop a detailed guidance on this emerging model, which is it's really coming along in practice, and how to create comprehensive plans to help communities become more sustainable, resilient, and equitable. And as I said, I'd like to spend some time on the Sustaining Places initiative by the American Planning Association, APA, which I truly believe is one of the most substantive contributions made by APA to planning practice. This initiative began with an announcement at the World Urban Forum in 2010 by then APA President Bruce Knight and CEO Paul Farmer. And as it developed, the initiative focused on the role of the local comprehensive plan in promoting sustainability. First, there was a task force assembled and a working group that developed standards and best practices for comprehensive plans. These are some of the milestones over a period of several years. And these standards became referred to as the Comprehensive Plan Standards for Sustaining Places, or standards for short. So the task force co-chairs were Bill Anderson and the late Dave Gottschalk, who played a key role and lead role in developing and disseminating the standards. So I had the privilege of working with Dave on this initiative, starting as a volunteer member of the original task force, and then continuing through my time as APA Research Director, which is when Dave and I co-wrote the PS report, Sustaining Places, Best Practices for Comprehensive Plans. And this report, which is available for free to APA members, describes the standards and the system for applying them to comprehensive plans in practice. And while I was research director, we also launched a pilot program to recognize exemplary comprehensive plans as measured by the standards. That went on for a couple of years, as you see here. A little bit about the content of the standards. They are really, they're not prescriptive. They're more of a framework that's organized around 10 components, 6 principles, 2 processes, and 2 attributes as shown on this slide. And the principles listed at the bottom address the substance of the comprehensive plan. The 2 processes are authentic participation and accountable implementation. And the 2 attributes, which Dave Gottschalk referred to as plan making design standards, in other words, how you put the plan together and communicate it to different audiences, are consistent content and coordinated characteristics. Now, the reason these components are important for the context of today's webinar is because they provide the organizing structure for our book. For each principle, process, and attribute, the standards, I'm going back again to the framework of standards identified in that PS report, identified best practices, which are described here as planning action tools that communities can incorporate into comprehensive plans. So our book uses the standards as a starting point, and it then delves much more deeply in the contemporary comprehensive planning practice than you can in the PS report. And before we get started in going through it, I'd like to highlight 4 key features. First, as indicated by the title, the role of comprehensive plan in advancing sustainability, resilience, and equity is foundational. It's a consistent theme throughout the book. Second, the book incorporates an approach in which a community is conceived as a system comprising interconnected subsystems, as illustrated by this figure, which, by the way, we're showing some figures throughout the presentation that are taken from the book. Now, this approach contrasts with a conventional comprehensive planning model, again, which Rocky and I grew up with, which was separate and discrete elements. You'd have land use, for example, transportation, economic development, prepared in silos and often by different subject matter experts. In other words, they were too often not integrated. Third, and this will come as no surprise to planners, our research revealed that implementation is the weakest part of the typical comprehensive plan. So a major focus of the book is on what it takes to effectively implement a comprehensive plan to achieve real-world impact or results. And finally, contemporary comprehensive plans, and we all know this from the times we're living in, need to deal with a level of change and uncertainty that's unprecedented in human history. Now, to address this, the book incorporates a model for dealing with change that my colleague Ben Hitchings and I, we presented this model in a Smart Growth Network webinar way back in March 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. And by the way, it says that the title of this slide is Managing Uncertainty, which is almost an oxymoron. I was thinking maybe Navigating Uncertainty might be better, but it just underscores a conundrum that communities find. We're all dealing with this uncertainty and we don't know how to deal with it. So the model that we came up with, and it's incorporated in this book, is we call drivers of change. And I can't get any detail on this, but basically what this model does is organize these drivers or global forces that are impacting communities into 4 broad categories: social, technological, economic, and environmental. And you see examples of what these drivers are on this slide. And just to make 2 key points. First, there's many points of overlap and interconnection between different drivers. And second, the challenge for the comprehensive plan, I think the new model of comprehensive plan that's emerging needs to deal with this, is to help communities prepare for drivers of change in a proactive, integrated way, as opposed to the reactive piecemeal way that's now the norm, if they are to succeed in an increasingly uncertain world. This slide, make the point here that Rocky and I, we reviewed literally dozens of contemporary comprehensive plans. And we provide many examples of leading practices drawn from these plans throughout the book. This map actually shows locations of plans we cite in the book, and I should emphasize that these are US plans, with one exception, which I think is Vancouver up there in the upper left above Seattle. And I know that there's an international audience, and thank you for joining us from other countries. And I think even though we don't address any international examples, I think many of the things that we'll be talking about today apply to in international context. I think with that, I'll turn it over to Rocky to begin a walkthrough of the book. And just as a heads up, how we're going to handle this is we're going to outline each major part of the book and the chapter, and followed by highlights of its content. So we're going to walk through it, and I'll now turn it over to Rocky.
Rocky, you're on the screen. You just need to put it in full screen mode and unmute when you're ready.
So I've unmuted and show screen. Is that doing it? Nope.
It's too small.
You just need to go into full screen mode.
And I've got a few. There we go. Okay, guys. All right. Oops, but it started at the beginning. So you all know all of this stuff here. David, I just want to share with you again my thanks to Smart Growth Network and the Maryland Department of Planning, and let you know that I've actually this week been contacted by a colleague in Australia who is trying to work on something very similar for addressing the future of planning in that country. So just great to see some of these opportunities to expand these new models, these new paradigms, this new system of planning, where it adds value in this country and beyond here. So I'm going to do the walkthrough of the book here. Do you guys see too many different things? Do you see the chat box and stuff?
You were good.
Okay, you were good. Okay, cool. So just want to make sure it's not too cluttered on your end. So yeah, so the first part of the book really talks about the process, and David did a great job of leading into why we need to take a fresh approach, why business as usual needs to be revisited, and we need to look at new opportunities to further integration, more holistic thinking, all within this framework of sustainability, resiliency, and equity here. So in the first part of the book, we talk about setting the stage for the planning process, where we are now, where we're heading, where do we actually want to go, and how do we get there. So I'll briefly walk through each of these with you this morning here. So first was setting the stage. A lot of this draws from things that typically happen in planning, but we've given a strong emphasis that this is really the period to do a lot of listening, do a lot of information gathering. And if you just see the sequence of the bullets here, we're suggesting that there's a lot of time interacting with the community, interacting with the public, various aspects of the community before you actually scope out the framework. So David mentioned that authentic participation is a foundational concept here, and I'll just let you look at this here quickly. So again, from our perspective, authentic, genuine, and transparent engagement really involves all segments of the community throughout the process. So from setting the stage, to actually rolling up your sleeves and to begin working on the planning, and then through adoption, implementation, and monitoring here. This is colorful, but it's a way, again, to kind of communicate that the first part of any process is really all about that outreach, engagement, and connection and empowerment of community here. So again, if you just look at the categories we have on the left, we don't start with scoping. You know, it's really working, again, as I said, listening to people, getting information, understanding what's in play, understanding challenges, opportunities, setbacks, and so on, and then move forward with rich engagement throughout the process. And we can talk a little bit more about what that might look like with our Q&A session. This, by the way, is something that has been worked on at the University of Colorado with the work I do through the center, and we've used this particular engagement model in a number of projects, and it allows for adaptability and flexibility here. We've introduced to you already just kind of the sequence of what should go into a planning process, and so again, you see some of those sequence of phases that David mentioned here that are critical for developing the plan. But community engagement, again, you can see on this image, is foundational and happens throughout the process. So as we look at where we are now and where we have been, I mean, this is a great opportunity to get to know what the trends are, what are the things that are in play that add character and feature and identification to the community you're in. And I think one of the key takeaways here is knowing these trends, but we're lifting up a paradigm that you don't just plan for those trends. And that's where the subsequent chapters give you some guidance. So how do you get from knowing the trends, but figuring out where you really want to go, and what actions and steps do you need to take within the planning process to bend those trends? So we talk again about providing a foundation that is very future oriented here. I mean, your vision statement is looking at what you aspire to be as a community, outlining and articulating the key principles that you're wanting to address in the process. And again, goal statements, which again have that future orientation to them as well. So just some quick bullets here on what to do with a vision statement. It should be brief. I've seen a lot of different types of vision statements that are really rich, but there should always be a version of it that can just be articulated in a few key sentences to your audience here. We wanted to lift up, as David said, some examples we showcase in the book here. So Living Asheville is a recent plan that has moved into this model of looking at issues and challenges and opportunities in the community in a much more integrated and comprehensive way. So what you see here are the guiding principles that are used then to inform and direct and guide the subsequent provisions that you see in that community's comprehensive plan. So how do we get there then? Again, it's working key from your vision and goals that you've set up to articulate them in policy and action here. You're going to see throughout our presentation, again, we never really leave the topic of community engagement. It just needs to be permeating what you're doing in each and every step of the process here. This is an example of kind of a new approach for future land use. This is actually from the city of Aurora, which is here in Colorado, a recently adopted plan in 2019, where they have evolved their whole understanding of land uses into place types. So very intriguing that they have reimagined their city in terms of these different types of places. Some are significant and rich places in terms of future mixed use nodes or centers. Others are ways of looking at commercial and industrial locations in the city here. And again, I think just a very impressive way of moving beyond traditional land use maps and what has often been typical in plans. Now we're going to move into the substance of the plans here. So this is really the core of content here. And we'll go through several different chapters here. Again, David already laid out for you that we see the community as a system. And so what we're looking at the plan to do is to articulate subsystems within the plan. So even though as we present this morning, we kind of bullet out things, our real approach is, again, to look at these things as interrelated, interconnected. So with the natural systems in a community, we're looking at all those aspects that make up the ecosystem and articulate then what are the issues for each of these, but how are they interconnected, and how do you come up with more integrated, multi-dimensional solutions, and not just look at these one-off and take one-dimensional approaches here. Just showcasing one particular thing we do with the environmental systems section is to look at the one water approach. A lot of you are no doubt familiar with this. Again, a lot of times when I teach about this in my classes and so on, I'll go on the journey with the students of where we were in the 70s as we began to develop a framework for addressing water quality and clean water. But, you know, it has been siloed for so long. Water supply has been the purview of one agency or department. Stormwater management, wastewater management, a lot of these things were, again, just treated in a very fragmented way. So bringing it all together is just a rich opportunity. Not only does it achieve efficiencies, it's a way to really lift up conscious stewardship of our resources here. The built environment systems is fun. This is really kind of the bread and butter of what most plans deal with. There's a lot here, so we cover it in 2 chapters. So the first part of it deals with issues such as development patterns, how we make communities more complete, lifting up the evolution from 20th century more Euclidean approaches to segregated zoning to more mixed use, and again, bring in issues of community character and green development in this section. So complete communities, again, you're going to see David and I love to move from lists to things that show integration and connections here. So for a community to be complete, it needs to have vibrancy and equity and a real embrace of all these various aspects that either traditionally have been seen as part of the built environment or are very important in terms of how we live, work, and play within the built environment itself here. I should note too, with this particular slide here, we really try to emphasize that even though we come up with concepts that we think are rich for comprehensive planning, we're also very aware that not every community is the same. So with something like complete communities, I mean, it's our vision that each and every community should be all it can be. Whether it's a growing community or a community experiencing population loss, whether it's a large town, a small town, a county, a township, you know, each and every place has the opportunity to be, again, all it can be with the foundations of sustainability, resiliency, and equity here. So complete communities framework, again, I mentioned this already, you know, transitioning from just kind of that single purpose land use notion that dominated the 20th century to looking at relationships, mixes, and the types of uses that are mutually reinforcing here. We want to acknowledge too that community character is a core principle that we lift up here too. So there's a part of this chapter that goes through the richness and importance of communities design, resources, historic and cultural resources, public places, and the arts here. The second part of the built environment then deals with additional issues. You might look at these as maybe facilities and services that are important to support life, work, and quality of life within the built environment here. So with mobility, we lift up the notion of mobility for all. There's a lot of rich information in this chapter on the current state of who has access to transportation, who doesn't, and how can we evolve into a future where mobility is provided to all, regardless of your need and capacity here. A part of this section also goes into emerging concepts of re-looking at our streets and thoroughfares to make them more sensitive to the context in which they're located, to have streets be about more than vehicles, and to provide opportunity for all modes of travel, and that there's an aspect of them too, that the way we deal with environmental impacts, particularly stormwater management, is something that's green and renewable here. And again, finally, then looking at other types of facilities and services, particularly utilities, we need to change that paradigm too, where it goes beyond, every utility or service doing their own thing, to looking at interrelationship and how to be more effective and conscientious going forward. Third system we deal with are social systems here. This ties very well and very cleanly into the framework of the equity foundational point in the plan here. We also talk about environmental justice. This is the section of the book where we get into issues of housing. And again, similar to what we said about mobility for all, housing for all. So how do we truly get a handle around understanding what the housing need is for the entire community, all individuals, families, households within your community, and make sure that those needs are met here. You saw us talk a little bit about green infrastructure with the environmental systems, and obviously traditional facilities and services infrastructure in the section on the built environment services here. This is kind of an emerging concept too in planning right now, this whole notion of social infrastructure. So we've just kind of showcased and highlighted here some of the components and aspects of what we mean with that there. So our last system then is economic systems. And David and I are very committed to working with this evolving notion of moving beyond simple economic development and just going after the growth for the sake of growth, but really embracing how a community can shift to becoming more economically resilient and to lift up economic opportunity for all, and not just that one-off, one-dimensional chasing growth as a way to see the future here. So we talk a lot about local assets and highlighting those as you grow your economic opportunities into the future. Green, circular, and sharing economies get some attention. And I think this captures really well some of what we're trying to communicate here. I mean, the old approach of how we went around economics is, you brought the resources into play, you worked with those, created products, you distributed them, consumed them, and then kaboom, they're discarded. So We really can move, and many places in the US, many places around the globe are moving more towards this circular economy here, where reuse, recycling, and adaptive future for materials and goods that have already been consumed are a key part of the whole economic framework going into the future. So healthy communities is something that we see permeates all of these systems here. So similarly to what you saw with climate inequity, we lift up this notion of applying a health lens here, and that health should be something that is touched on in each and every area of policies there. I like the little tags we have there on the bottom of this slide. Those of you who are familiar with planning history know that the genesis for planning, and we're coming up on the 100th anniversary this decade of the Standard Zoning Enabling Act, the Standard Planning Enabling Act, and health, safety, and general welfare were really foundational for why planning was launched as a discipline and profession in this country. A lot of what I have seen happen in recent decades is to reclaiming those roots of healthy communities. And again, when we talk about health, we're not just talking about treating illness or disease prevention. You can see here with this image, the health tie-in to so much of how we live. I mean, the social aspects of health, the economic aspects of health, built environment, education, and so on. That again, it's much more than disease prevention, and our built environment can really be designed and planned in a way to lift up human health, safety, and so on here. We offer an example of a health assessment lens. So this is something that comes out of work here in Colorado that we did over a multi-year period. We ended up with like 24 partners. Interesting to see the slide at the beginning with all the partners that support these webinars. We have a lot of those same partners with state level organizations in Colorado who are part of this Healthy Places Collaborative, bringing together engineers, planners, people from the health professions, real estate interests, and so on here. So again, you can just see with this particular image of the health assessment lens, this is an intro to the use of that particular tool. It touches on a lot more than disease and human wellness here. So David will pick up and continue at this point and work on implementation and then the future of the comp plan. So thank you. And is there anything I need to do to go away, or have you made that happen?
We'll take care of that, Rocky. Thanks.
Okay, thank you guys so much.
Okay, thanks, Rocky. I think I'm on unmuted, and do you see my screen?
Yes, you just need to go back into full screen mode.
I need to go into a slideshow mode, which I'm doing now. And before I pick up on, by the way, Rocky just went through a lot of the book, and part 2 is actually the substance of the plan, is the most substantive of the book. So it's a long part. It's a lot in it. All we can do in the time we have here is to scratch the surface. But we'd certainly be, we're looking forward to questions and discussion afterwards. We'd certainly be happy to answer questions about any of these topics or others that relate to the comprehensive plan. So I'm going to continue with the last chapter in part 2, but actually, before I do that, I wanted to go back to something Rocky said covered in part 1, in which he laid out the three phases of the planning process. Well, there's actually 4 is where we put it: setting the stage, getting organized, and then where are we now and where are we headed? That's sort of the assessment of current conditions and trends. Where do we want to go and how do we get there? And that's common way of conducting comprehensive planning processes. But the one thing I wanted to mention, because it was shown on this slide, was what we often forget is where we are now is very much a product of what's happened in the past. And he highlighted a couple of influences: institutional racism, automobile-oriented development, which we're dealing with today. So it's something you have to remember and doing a comprehensive plan. You just don't start where you are and look towards the future. You need to deal with the past and understand the forces from the past that are influencing the present before you can plan for the future. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. There has been, I wouldn't even say often, typically overlooked in the comprehensive plans of the past. In any event, let me move on with chapter 12. So this is a final chapter in part 2, and it addresses connections to the region as a whole, and which are often ignored or barely addressed in traditional comprehensive plans, which really tend to focus on the jurisdiction, not so much on what's around it. So I'd like to highlight 2 key concepts from this slide. First is the importance of regional coordination and cooperation to address all those issues that transcend jurisdictional boundaries. And coordination, what that means is aligning the policy and action recommendations of the comp plan with those of adjacent jurisdictions or region as a whole. So thinking regionally as you're developing your policy strategies and actions. And cooperation refers to working together on common initiatives. So an example could be developing a regional open space network. And returning to our notion or our approach of systems thinking, the second key point concept is that systems like water, mobility, infrastructure obviously transcend jurisdictional boundaries as well. So if you're planning those systems, you need to be addressing their broader context and connecting the regional systems and even beyond. So this figure captures the idea of planning across scales, including federal and state mandates and policy directions that drive planning and policy at the regional level and local levels, and then the need for local jurisdictions to address connections to regional systems in the comp plan. So it goes back and forth, and you can see, again, thinking about these systems as regional and extending even beyond the region. So this next slide, as you can see, there is an additional scale of concern that is really that's emerged in the 21st century. And actually, just this morning, I saw that there was a new book by Lincoln Institute of Land Policy on mega regions, which they say is the future, which is interesting. So this has become a consideration for regions and communities to address, because when you think about it, impacts don't, like, say, severe weather effects, economic shocks, don't confine themselves to communities or regions, but they're often mega regional in their effects. So this figure from the Regional Plan Association that did a lot of the seminal work on mega regions shows 11 emerging mega regions across the US. Where I'm speaking to you today from the Northeast mega region, where I'm thinking back to Hurricane Sandy in 2013. Those were mega regional impacts, impacted this whole mega region. And Rocky's speaking to you from the Front Range mega region out in Colorado. So we touch on mega regions. We don't get into it in any great detail, but I think it's something that it's going to be very important to think about, and more so as we move into the future. So that concludes part 2. The third major section of the book is called Forward to Implementation. And in keeping with our focus on effective implementation, chapter 13 is one of the longest and most substantive chapters of the book. It just kind of ended up that way. Chapters 14 to 16 cover the plan attributes from the comp plan standards. If you remember that slide early on, Dave Gottschalk referred to these as plan making design standards. And the final chapter, which is what I'll end on, conveys our thoughts about the future of the comprehensive plan. So let's look a little bit at chapter 13. It covers the components of an effective implementation section. I think planners are generally familiar with these: strategies and actions, guidance, policy guidance for operations, day-to-day operations and decision making, and importantly, measures to monitor progress over time. which is key to accountable implementation. So nuts and bolts, we need to define who's responsible for act strategies and action, when's it's going to happen, how are the resources and funding, where's that going to come from, and which partners are we going will we work with, will the community work with in implementing the plan. So the chapter also incorporates a model that I developed years ago with Gardner Stoll of Austin. We called this model levels of implementation. And you can see a graphic of this model here on the slide. And I think it's useful to understand what's involved, the scope of an effective implementation program, and how all these different elements work together. So where it begins is with community engagement in plan development and implementation. That's the foundation. Again, community engagement, inclusive community engagement is foundational to a successful comprehensive plan. So then you'll see a series of 4 levels. These are arranged in order of approximate degree of difficulty. So level 1, which often is as far as planning departments they get in implementing the comp plan, deals with regulations, revising development codes, ordinance, incentives to implement the plan. Level 2 is public investment, using the plan to guide capital improvement planning and annual budget allocations. This was more the practice actually in the past than it has been in recent decades, but I think that's changing now. Austin is actually an example of they have a capital improvements office that uses their comprehensive plan as a guide. Level 3 is organizational alignment. What this refers to using the plan to guide work programs, decision making by the overall administration and then individual line departments, which you think would be a no-brainer, but we all know that departments have their separate missions and silos and tend to operate independently. So the idea is to get everyone in line within the local government to implement the plan. And the final level, level 4, is partnerships. And it says here, build cross-sectoral partnerships and leverage resources for implementation. And obviously in the comp plan, typically we identify responsible parties who who we might work with, or the local government we work with on certain actions. But the idea here is to have a more comprehensive ongoing program in which foundations, private sector, other organizations are all aligned and directing their efforts towards comprehensive plan implementation. And I must admit, Garner and I didn't really find any place where this was really was the norm. So I spent a little bit of time on this slide, but I do think it's an important model. So moving on to chapter 14, consistency and coordination. This chapter addresses internal consistency and integration, as well as external consistency and coordination as key attributes of a successful comp plan. So internal consistency, that means the contents of the comprehensive plan are integrated. It's the plan is consistent with other jurisdictional plans like area plans, functional plans. It should form an umbrella for those in the form of the policies of the comp plan, providing guidance for these other plans and implementing regulations. And external consistency means consistency with the plans and policies of other levels of government. I referred to this before, and coordination with the plans of adjacent jurisdictions. So just quickly looking at taking a closer look at the internal consistency and integration. This diagram shows how the comprehensive plan document, the strategies and actions it contains, and implementing plans and regulations should be fully consistent with that umbrella plan, the comprehensive plan and its policy framework. So moving on to chapter 15, covers how to design and effectively communicate the comprehensive plan to community members. Communication is essential throughout the planning process and should be expressed in a final plan document that's graphically compelling, written in clear and engaging language, and presented in user-friendly formats. So the formats, and we see that in practice today, go beyond the traditional paper document and its digital, what I call its digital successor, the static PDF file, to include accessible, interactive online platforms. So let me just give you a couple of examples. The first that we cited in the book, the first is the Stearns 2040 Comprehensive Plan for Stearns County, Minnesota, which I think is an example of a really a well-organized and graphically compelling comprehensive plan document. It's organized around 5 pillars, which are the 5 pillars of the vision statement shown on the right, and each has focus areas that lay out detailed policies and strategies. So you can't really read this on the slide, but the upper one here, Stearns County is an agricultural county. So it has focus areas for agriculture, which include agricultural use, crop and product diversity, animal agriculture, and clean energy. And let me just take a quick detour because we had an advanced question. Thank you for the question that was sent in, which was, when discussing future energy needs and food sheds, please address the conflict of maintaining local food sources versus large-scale solar installations on not always prime farmland. So the point I'm going to make here is if you look at the focus area here, you see clean energy as one, and it lays out policies for dealing with conflicts such as these. And it might not be exactly what's being experienced in the jurisdiction that the question came from, but the point is a comprehensive plan that as an umbrella document, the policy should set direction for how to address issues such as this one. And there's a link here to Stearns 2040 if anyone's interested in following up on that. The next one is the Big Picture Comprehensive Plan. I love that name. The Big Picture Comprehensive Plan for Huntsville, Alabama, which is an example of a user-friendly online format. So noteworthy features, this is a screen capture from the landing page. You can see it's well designed as an invitation to users to explore plan contents by clicking on 4 tabs across the top. You can see them: principles, policies, places, and process. And each of these gives you links to more detailed information. The bottom line, it's easy to navigate, so you can get as deep into the plan as you want. The last of these, the last of the plan chapters covering plan attributes is on maintaining and updating the plan. And the fundamental premise of this book is that the process continues beyond plan adoption to include ongoing implementation activities, monitoring progress, regularly updating the plan to keep pace with change, and all engaging the community. And the book identifies 2 ways of monitoring progress. The first is very simply, we call it implementation monitoring, but it's very simply tracking whether you're doing the things you said you do in the plan. So that needs to be an ongoing process, at least once a year through a checklist or something similar. And the second, performance monitoring, uses targets, benchmarks, or indicators to measure the extent to which are you actually realizing the goals as you implement the strategies and actions. So implementation monitoring and performance monitoring. Let me give you an example of performance monitoring. Lincoln and Lancaster County, Nebraska, they maintain a combined city and county comprehensive plan. So the city and county annually publish a community indicators report, and it's specifically designed to monitor community change and assess whether the assumptions of the plan remain valid and whether its goals are being achieved. So you can see the indicators are organized into 6 categories: growth, economy, environment, housing, transportation, and recreation. And presumably these tie to goals laid out and strategies laid out in the comprehensive plan. So that takes us up to the last chapter of the book, the future of the comprehensive plan. And this chapter provides our thoughts on what the comprehensive plan must continue to evolve into if it's to effectively address those critical challenges of the 21st century that I started with. So in this chapter, we identify 5 key directions in which we think comprehensive planning practice must evolve to yield truly sustainable, resilient, and equitable outcomes. So you can see them here: equity and engagement, climate change, systems thinking, people-centered technology, and effective implementation. And we've touched on most or all of these throughout our presentation, but I'll just close by taking a little bit of a closer look at 3 of them, starting with equity and engagement, which we think is foundational. The comprehensive plan of the future will advance the principle of interwoven equity by giving voice to and providing for the needs of all community members. And that's how we frame these 5 directions as statements. So what this means is applying an equity lens, as Rocky was displaying those lenses in his part of the presentation, to all goals, strategies, policies, and actions of the comprehensive plan, engaging all segments of the community throughout the planning process, and prioritizing equity during implementation. And that means monitoring who benefits and who needs are met by the actions that are taken to implement the plan. The next one I'll highlight is climate change mitigation and adaptation. The comprehensive plan of the future will set the direction for communities to address climate change, the existential environmental threat of the 21st century. So what this means is, again, to apply a climate lens to all goals, strategies, policies, and actions. And we're saying the comprehensive plan needs to both address mitigation and adaptation. So to address mitigation, this means climate positive planning and design solutions. We need to go beyond the current benchmark, which is net zero, to reduce the amount of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. So the comprehensive plan needs to work towards that goal. And to address adaptation, critically important as communities are experiencing the impacts of climate change. We all are experiencing that as a guiding principle. The third one I'm going to, I'll close with this slide, I'm going to end with is people-centered technology. The comprehensive plan of the future will harness technology to engage and serve the community. And so 2 key points here. First, use technology during the planning process to engage the community in defining priorities and solutions to address them, which in turn can use technology. And the engagement in the planning process, by the way, has been called participatory co-creation. And second, use technology as a tool during implementations. As I just said, the solution, how you implement those solutions you come up with in the planning process. Now, if I had time, I could get into how this might be done, using things like sensor networks, aka the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, smart city digital twins, and the like. But what's most important, the bottom line is, it's not about the latest and greatest technology, which is what we tend to focus on, but how that technology serves people and will accomplish the goals of the comprehensive plan. That brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. Rocky and I thank you, and I just thought I'd like to leave you with a quote from the famed anthropologist Margaret Mead that I think sums up the potential of the comprehensive plan. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Again, thank you. And here's our discount code again. So again, you can go to the Rutledge website and get 20% off on the book. So we look forward to questions and discussions, our questions and discussion. And with that, I'll turn it back to Michael.
Great, thank you, David. We'll have you and Rocky turn on your cameras as we move into the Q&A. And thanks to everybody who has submitted questions. We're going to go for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more today, given the volume of questions that came in. And I'll just note, I guess, maybe the 2 of you want to respond to this. There were a lot of questions about the specific examples that you cited, but I'm guessing that that's probably a bit of a deeper dive than we have time for today, and possibly they need to look at the book for that. But I don't know if you wanted to highlight anything in addition.
Well, you could ask them. Let me just point out that we only picked a few, and they're not necessarily the best. I mean, they're all good, but we have a lot of that's one thing I think that sets this book apart, because we did, and Rocky, you can weigh in. We did so much research, and we found and actually, let me make a point here. We did so much research, and we found so many great examples that we populated the book with it. So hopefully it gives you an idea of what what communities are doing, leading edge practices we talked about before. But one point I wanted to make during the presentation was we didn't find any plan that perfectly encapsulated all these directions that we would hold up as a single model. It was more like they did this really well or that very well. And we think there's a lot of room for growth in comprehensive planning practice, which is what our last chapter was about. Where do communities need to do to get to that point where all comp plans are exemplary? Rocky, you want to add something?
Yeah, no, thanks, David, and you're spot on there. So I might actually elaborate a little bit. So that map we showed you were of specific places we showcased and highlighted as examples. We actually brought in some other notes or points that we found from other communities around the U.S. too, even though we didn't necessarily dedicate a full discussion of what was in play there as an example. But I mean, it was exhilarating, I think, going through the landscape of where planning is today, and already seeing some of the pieces of what we lift up in terms of what the future of the comp plan should be. But David is right. I mean, there's places that do more with integration or more focus on one system or another. And we're hoping this publication can really help with, again, moving beyond business as usual and getting places throughout the country, whether you're in a state that has strong planning legislation or simple enabling legislation. The job can be done to make that transition to a comp plan that is very transformative for a community.
Okay, thank you. So I'll also note that given the topic area and the volume of questions, that many of these are very broad and look at different elements. So unlike when we have a more specific topic that really hones in on aspects, many of these questions are all over the place. So just I'll forewarn you on that.
Okay.
So the first question here today is there value in having multiple functional plans, each addressing major topics, instead of having one larger comprehensive plan?
Well, David, maybe I'll try that first.
Sure,
and
go ahead.
See if you agree or go in a different direction. I think the comprehensive plan, and we've made that point, needs to be the umbrella document and should be the go-to document with the entire array of overall goals, policies, and intent for a jurisdiction. Now, with that said, yes, there's obviously value in having some more detailed functional plans around specific issues or themes, such as bicycle plan, pedestrian plan, water plan, or whatever. But I mean, what we see too often and what we want jurisdictions to guard themselves against is that, these all become independent plans, and it just adds to muddle confusion. So I'm actually working with one of my colleagues here at the University of Colorado, looking at a few jurisdictions here that have developed some very amazing functional plans as well as comprehensive plans, but there's no relationship explained. So which plan do you go to? I would caution against having policies in your functional plans, that you should just have a one-stop place in your city-wide or county-wide comprehensive plan with the entire policy framework. If new issues come up as you're dealing with a specific issue in a functional plan that requires some policy attention, bring that into the comprehensive plan. But I mean, it makes it much more usable, predictable, and easier for staff, for members of the community, for investors, developers, as well as decision makers you know, if you've got this central core policy framework for all plans.
Yeah, I know we have lots to get to, so I'll just quickly add 2 points to actually reinforce what Rocky said about as long as the functional plans are consistent with the framework set by the comp plan, great. And the great thing about that is that they allow you to get a lot more detail than the comp plan does. We used to say when I was working at WRT doing comp plans that the comprehensive plan was a 30,000-foot elevation overview, the umbrella, but you can get right down into the ground and like work out a lot of stuff and details. Well, how are we going to implement these policies? That's the kind of thing you can work out in the functional plan, as long again as it's consistent with the policy framework set by the comp plan.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, David. Here are quite a couple questions about the impact of comp plans in a couple different contexts. So the first one is, can you speak to saying no? Often developers want to do things that conflict with the plan. Elected officials cave in and department heads fall in line. And over time, the cumulative result is that a great, thoughtful plan is undermined. What can we do about that?
Yeah. I'll start with that one too, David. I mean, we touch on, I mean, we don't go into detail in this particular book on, you know, all of the planning frameworks that exist across the country, state by state. But I mean, some of them do create a system in which the comprehensive plan is legally binding, has standing, and so decisions have to be made with respect to that. Other parts of the country, I think what's being kind of suggested in that question is, you know, they are presented as more advisory or recommendations. Now, I would say, regardless of the state system that a jurisdiction is working under for its plan, it's the way that the jurisdiction adopts the plan to make it serious and make it meaningful and say, this is the go-to document that we're using for everything. So a developer understands that, the community understands it, the staff and elected officials understand that as well. So that can happen. David, you've had some.
Yeah, this question gets sort of the heart of the dilemma of planning in general, because planning is political. It happens in a political context.
Exactly.
And depending on, and Rocky is right. I mean, there are some states have pretty strict, you know, regulatory frameworks and requirements for comp plans, making them legally binding. Others not at all. So, but I think I got to back up for a second. Again, I'm going back to my time at WRT. We practice what we called values-driven planning, and the whole point was the comp plan is about the values of the community. So the planning process is meant to bring those values out and articulate them in terms of, well, how do we turn that into vision and action? And if you have a plan that reflects the values of the community, if you have like had strong community engagement, because the community is who elects they elect those elected officials, so they're ultimately accountable. If you have that level of engagement and foundation, then I think you'll be in as good a position as you can be. And I'll just pull out one example from my past, which is, I mentioned probably pronounced Lancaster County, Nebraska, but I've done a lot of work in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where they have a strong value around the agricultural landscape and the economy, sort of driven by the Plains-Sec farmers. And everyone agreed that we need to protect and maintain that working agricultural landscape. So that was the values of the community, and the developers and all fell in line around it. But the flip side of that was, well, where do we build? And the designated growth areas were designated, and that's where all the battles happen. Like, developers wanting to build within some of these communities, but everyone agreed that they wanted to preserve the agricultural landscape around it. So that's just one example of how that idea of values-driven planning can play out.
Okay, thanks, David. So I guess a related question here then is, why do comprehensive plans tend to be forgotten so quickly? What is their usual shelf life, and how can we extend that shelf life?
Mhm.
I'll start here since you started the last couple. Well, first of all, I think the framework or the idea that we laid out is that the comprehensive planning process doesn't stop with adoption, which implies, oh, we did this great plan, we'll put it on the shelf and not think about it, which I think is what the question's about. But basically, it needs to be an ongoing process, and think it doesn't end with adoption of the plan. So what that means is, for example, and we found some examples in New England towns where they set up comprehensive plan working groups to like shepherd and continue oversee implementation with residents involved in it. So it's really engaging the community in implementation, doing regular monitoring and updates. You know, we recommend, and this is, I think, pretty standard in practice, is the idea at least annually you do it. You monitor the plan, you do reports on the plan, report back to the community, identify, well, what did we do, what didn't we do during the last year, what new issues have arisen that we have to address. So do that annually. And then we recommend 5 years to 10 years at the most. Well, 5 years do a major update, and maybe 10 years to look in doing. 10 years is a long time nowadays, given how things are changing. Look at doing another whole full-blown comprehensive planning process, but it needs to be worked at over time. It just, the job isn't done. It's only beginning when you've adopted the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, and David's spot on, and I think he's articulated that really well. The other thing I would add is, I mean, you need to have the community have a mindset that the plan is a living document. So again, I mean, we can't emphasize that enough, that adoption isn't the end point. In many respects, it's really the launch of what you're doing with the plan. So.
Let me throw in one other thing, because that's the typical, the shelf document, and I've written many in the past comp plans documents that are 6 inches thick or whatever, and they're boring. People don't read them. The only people that read the full plan are probably the planners who wrote it, but that's why the formatting and communication and presentation of the plan is so important. And we have so many opportunities now with people are used to the web and putting things online. Having a really strong, graphically compelling executive summary is really important. So that's what people could read and really get the essence. If you do that well, that captures people's imagination. So I think things are changing from that old model of like the policy document that's a paper document and that ends up on the shelf. On the other hand, there's plenty of those type documents still being done today. So practice tends to change slowly.
Yeah. Just one more word too. Again, I mean, accessible. That has to be an accessible document, and then the engagement point that we said. I think that helps to have it continue to have life. So.
Okay, thank you. I think, David, you kind of addressed part of this question, next question here, and what you just said, but I just wanted to clarify, given that we received it as a question, and that is, what is the time horizon for the local comprehensive plan? And do you still recommend staying with a 20-year planning horizon with 5-year updates?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's hard to be really what's hard and fast about these rules from two standpoints. First of all, everything's changing so quickly. But on the other hand, the impacts you're looking at, like climate change, sea level rise, can be 100 years out in the future. The full impacts might not be realized for 100 years from now. So, I do think like the 20-year time horizon for a vision statement is useful to set some kind of a frame for that. And I think 5-year updates is realistic, because I don't think a community is going to get it together to redo a comprehensive plan and take any way of a deep look at the comprehensive plan, except every 5 years. 1 year reviews, I think, are really important. But I'll just try to take a stab at something I've been thinking about, is that what you really need to do is think about all these time horizons at the same time, because you need to in work, short-term, mid-term strategy and long-term vision. And don't think of the vision. I mean, communities like to write these vision statements that are wonderful. Some of them are very eloquent, but they're like an end state. Well, if we
Right.
just keep working at these actions, in 20 years, we'll achieve this vision. That's not the way a vision works. It's meant as an expression of the potential of the community to work towards, but it's always going to be changing and moving in the future. So just don't think about it as being a hard and fast rule, this thing about 20 years. It's expressing, it's a way of tracking your aspirations for the future and working towards them and seeing if what you're doing in the short term and midterm is heading you in the right direction.
Yeah, I'll just make one point too. There's a convenience, to be honest, with the 5-year update, 20-year horizon, in that it's using multiples of 10, and we get census information every 10 years here in the country. So that's just kind of clean, I think. If you're working with new information that comes out of a census, and that informs a plan, gets revisited again in 5 years for an update. At the 10-year point, you have new census information that gives you kind of a window into looking at the 20-year horizon you had set previously, and to refine that for the next 20 years. So that's nice. I'll just say Minneapolis, St. Paul has a really intriguing system there, so that they're actually on a 8-year cycle, so 4-year and 4-year. So they spend part of their time working on the regional plan. And once that gets adopted, the regional staff actually provides service and counsel to localities then to bring their local plans into conformity with the regional plan during the next 4-year cycle. So that's another kind of intriguing model with looking at dates and sequencing for the purpose of consistency and coordination.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question here is from Michael Greenwald, who says, the thrust of this presentation appears to have an implicit assumption that we're starting from or near a position of a clean slate, but that assumption is rarely realized in the real world. How would this approach that you're describing deal with incorporating reuse and redevelopment? And do you have recommendations on how to generate the necessary community support to do this kind of work?
Okay.
You want to take that, Rocky? Or start?
Yeah. So okay. Well, again, I think, and it's so hard to take a whole book like this and just kind of give you guys some high clip highlights. Dennis or David did mention that you have to work with where you've been. So and the examples he lifted up was inequities, issues of racism, auto-dominated development patterns, and so on. So yeah, I mean, we're not saying it's a clean slate here. You need to deal with what you have, but look at it, be informed by it, and figure out where you want to go with that. So that's one point I would make with this. The other point is in the section where we discuss development patterns, we put a lot of time and effort into talking about strategies for infill and redevelopment. So we encourage each and every jurisdiction to do an assessment of whether you want to call it developable lands or buildable lands, but look at that opportunity. Where do you have vacant lands? Where do you have underutilized lands? And how can those be activated again to make the community more whole? So we're definitely not saying this is about just new development that you can do beyond existing urbanization. David, you want to add anything to that?
I'm surprised that, thanks for that observation, because I guess we should look at our presentation, and we actually prioritize revitalization, infill development over new development. And I guess we only could cover so much in our presentation, but I'll give one example actually in the economic systems chapter. Fiscal sustainability, and we draw actually on a work of Chuck Marone, Strong Towns, in which he's written about basically, and he's a formerly an engineer by trade. Now he does a lot more than that. But basically, how extending, and he's not the only one, but I think he does a really good job of making this argument, how extending new infrastructure out for new development, it ends up costing much more money in the long run than investing in the existing infrastructure. Fiscal, it'll never pay for itself, and the way to be fiscally sustainable is to invest in your areas served by existing infrastructure, which often tend to be neglected.
Right.
And not have gotten investment, say from city leaders who think that new development is what's going to build the tax base, but actually the reverse is true. So many, if not most of our examples in the book are from existing developed communities that I would say they're mature communities. And there's a question for mature communities, which is, you develop, and say you have boundaries and you reach the limits of your boundaries with development. You're not static. You're always going to change. So you need different strategies and approaches to think about how you develop. And I'm thinking about developing like a human being develops in the future, so you can remain sustainable, fiscally viable, et cetera. So it's planners have often like prioritized and develop growth scenarios and all that kind of stuff. We do talk about that, but it's existing mature communities that face some of the many issues, and I think are coming up with some very interesting solutions to dealing with the issues, the challenges we lay out in the book. That was a little long-winded. I apologize.
No, that's good. Again, yeah. Let's go back and revisit that, David, so that that gets emphasized.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Avery Livengood, who says, one of the most significant and important aspects of a community from an equity perspective is local schools, but education is generally the purview of the school district and state funding formulas, not within the purview of the comprehensive plan. How can the comp plan serve as a single umbrella document without addressing local schools and education? And does your book address this gap?
I would say, yes, that's obviously an issue with the way we govern it in this country. And it's not just schools, it's special districts in general, I would say. So we discussed that in the book. Again, this whole notion of consistency and coordination that needs to not only be embraced in terms of jurisdiction to jurisdiction, whether that's a municipality or a county, jurisdiction to region, but I mean other entities that make decisions that relate to all of the systems we discussed, built environment and so on. So we do talk about schools specifically as part of the social infrastructure, but yes, I mean any special district or entity that has kind of a governing function should be integrated into this process. So I can give a lot of examples where, school districts kind of go off on their own and so on, as well as examples of places that have figured out how to bring the school districts into play, and so that they've got an understanding of the visions and expectations of the community with how they run their school district and provide their facilities. David, you may have some.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I actually think schools are, it's true, Rocky, all special districts are important. Schools are probably the most single most important type of special, if you call them special district or whatever, authorities, independent agencies of them all, and so important to the success of a community. And we see tremendous disparities in schools, obviously, from inner cities to more affluent suburban communities. But and no, we don't get into great detail on this issue. One thing about the book, it's covering such a broad scope that we can't. But I think just thinking about a couple of things, and I think, Rocky, you mentioned this. I've actually done comp plans where they had education as an element. The one I'm thinking of, actually, I think that the education department might have been part of city government rather than separate, but it comes in the partnerships. And I went through that levels of implementation model. And what it means is if the school, what it may imply is if the schools are separate agency, they need to be engaged from the beginning of the comprehensive planning effort. They need to be brought in and understand the importance and how they can best serve the community, and then form some kind of partnership in implementation. So engaging, this is true of any special district or whatever you want to call it, engaging them and then bringing them forward into implementation in the form of partnerships. And they might be a partnerships. It's not just the schools. It could be whatever. It could be major employers, institutions, universities, obviously, which are important, businesses. And that's the idea of an integrated partnership model for implementation that, again, I haven't seen anywhere. The closest to it was actually Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I'll only talk about this for a second, but when they did their revitalization, they formed a group, a community group of representatives across sectors to lead that forward. It was a vision plan. It wasn't a comp plan, but that's and that was decades ago. That's the closest I've ever seen to it.
I'll just offer quickly, my email's there. Send me a note if you want some more information. Another really great example, David, is in King County. I'll just quickly say there were several school districts there that, I mean, just did their own population projections, were doing kind of their own facility planning and so on, did not at all connect with the county's comp plan. And so they engaged in like a year process, which again started off a little rough, but everyone got on the same page. The school districts ended up kind of getting it and just redid their whole long-term strategy to better nest into what the county's comp plan was saying. So yeah, send me a note and I can get you in touch with more information on that.
Thanks, Rocky. Next question here is, how would you advise smaller communities where the comprehensive planning process is led principally by citizen planners to incorporate these concepts into their next comprehensive plan?
Well, that's a cool question. And, you know, I've had an opportunity in my career to see that actually play out. And to be honest, I noticed on my email thread here, someone's already asked me a question about some of the best plans and so on, but I have seen really phenomenal local plans get developed that in small towns that were citizen driven. And again, I mean, they address information issues, the data gathering, you know, in a manner that's appropriate for their context. But have been able to, I think, produce some very rich plans that you know, are well received, well endorsed, not just by the elected officials they're transmitted to, but then by the community going forward. So very doable. I mean, David and I have talked at a few points too about, you know, there's a value in a lot of communities to have kind of that do-it-yourself aspect going on as part of the process. It's something planners shouldn't be afraid of. So I think it makes a rich contribution. So.
Yeah, that's another great question. I appreciate all the great questions coming in. And I'm going to just raise up one example we reference in the plan. I came across it just in researching. I think it's Topsham, Maine. I know nothing about Topsham, Maine, except they produce, I think they're like 7,000 people maybe, and they produced a beautiful comprehensive plan. So they figured out a way to do it. And by the way, they are one of the examples of New England communities that the first action in the plan was to form a comprehensive plan implementation committee to oversee implementation of the plan. But I'm going to go back also to the comprehensive plan standards for sustaining places. And they were on one of those slides. I don't think I highlighted it. There was when I first became APA research director, Dave Gottschalk and I and APA research staff, we put out a call for we called those pilot communities, but volunteer communities that were actually doing comprehensive plans that we would work with in refining the standards before we finalize them. And we got 10 communities. And there was one that was as small as 700 people. I think it was a village in maybe Massachusetts. I'm losing it. But in any event, the other communities, they were small communities. They're like, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. And they found that basic structure and framework of the comp plan standards is laid out in that PS report really useful. And they used that framework, and they didn't have consultants. It was planning staff doing. In that case, they may have had planning staff, but they found it really useful. And the other thing they said about those standards, we were very much concerned when we started that would like, oh, you can't have one size fits all standards, but they were flexible enough that they could be adapted to the needs. So I think that's where I think the real action is. Democracy in action is at the local level nowadays. It doesn't seem to be at the national level or state level anymore, but you can really see it. And that's one reason why I'm optimistic about the comprehensive plan, because that's where citizens can directly engage, and smaller communities can really have direct engagement. I'll mention one other thing, which is a community heart and soul is a process that's not exactly a comprehensive planning process, but it's geared, it's like a comprehensive planning process. It's geared towards smaller communities. I think it's the Orton Family Foundation that sponsors it, and they give grants to small communities. It's one way to get started. You can just probably Google community heart and soul and get more information. So that might be one place to start.
Yeah, that's great. I'll just tag onto that quickly. Yeah, so one of the communities here in the metropolitan area of Denver, City of Golden, worked with that heart and soul model. And I mean, what an amazingly rich and relevant plan they developed there. So.
Great, thank you. And thanks again to everybody submitting questions. I know we're already at 2:30 Eastern, but I think we're going to go about 10 more minutes or so, given the huge volume of questions that we've gotten. And obviously, everybody can also follow up with you directly. But for the next question here from Dave Anderson, he's asking, I've seen a lot of conversation on life cycle costing and return on investment analysis of development activity and infrastructure. Are you seeing that kind of analysis changing how capital facilities planning gets integrated into land use planning?
What do you think, Rocky? Are you seeing that?
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, David, and I know you joined us out here. We actually had a symposium in 2019. It was just a pre-pandemic year where we addressed that issue. And I mean, we do touch on that. One of the things we lifted up with that event we had in Colorado, and again, it had folks from throughout the country here interfacing with us. But yeah, I think you're hitting really on something, that there is a mismatch. We see so many jurisdictions that have infrastructure that is beyond its life cycle. Oftentimes when there's a failure, we just go in and do a little Band-Aid thing, right at the break point or whatever. And we do lift up, and I think, that one quick image we showed of a utilidor is part of this whole discussion that we have. Again, we need to change that paradigm, because we have infrastructure failure at all levels across this country here. So to basically look at a path forward where we're able to preserve and maintain and expand infrastructure as needed, and to, of course, just totally interface that with what we're doing with development patterns, land use planning, and similar. David, you may have some other thoughts.
Yeah, we do address, obviously, in planners, engineers, everyone talks about this. You need to account for full life cycle costs in making your capital investments. But it's easier to fund, and elected officials love shiny infrastructure. You can cut ribbons, and then what happens is the maintenance doesn't get funded.
Right.
It's not accounted for, and then our budgets get cut. So it's a continuing issue. And I'll just raise it in the context of green infrastructure, because I've done a lot of work on green infrastructure. And one of the pushbacks you get on green infrastructure, oh, it's so, how are we going to maintain it? We can't maintain all this green infrastructure. It's like, yeah, but look at the full life cycle cost. Look at first how much
Yes.
it costs to build gray infrastructure solutions initially. Then the idea is, well, then it's just buried. You don't have to think about it again. But then 20 years later, when it fails, think about how much it's going to cost to replace
Oh,
it. And I'm not
uh-huh.
saying green infrastructure necessarily instead of gray infrastructure, but the thing about green infrastructure, there's an ongoing cost, but initially it tends to be cheaper, and you're never going to have that like replacement cost. And the other thing is it generates what are called co-benefits along the way. So, you know, workforce, employment opportunities, you know, all the health benefits, et cetera, of green infrastructure. So you got to look at these things holistically and not just bottom line, you know, how much it's going to cost, and then forget about it till you have to pay for it even more
Yeah.
20 years from now.
Yeah, and I like you brought that up, David, because I was just going to bring into conversation. I mean, there's secondary and tertiary costs you need to be thinking about. So if you do have an infrastructure disruption, I mean, there's a certain cost to the entity that's maintaining that infrastructure for the repair, but I mean, it ripples through in terms of impacts on businesses, economy, neighborhoods, households, and so on. So, I mean, it's exponential to not be savvy with dealing with preservation and maintenance.
Great, thank you. We'll have a few more here. Next question here is, I guess, a process question, and that is, how does the RFP procurement and contract budgeting process work when you start the visioning process ahead of scoping?
Wow. Okay. I'll take that. We do have a section of the book that that talks about the RFPs and how to do RFPs, but I mean, you can do these things in sort of any order. It may be city council or town council or whatever has done a separate visioning exercise, and there's consensus that that's going to guide the comp plan. That's fine. The vision doesn't necessarily need to be part of the process. Normally it is, but you just need to adapt the RFP process to that particular context. One thing we used to do a lot when I was in practice is we would work with communities. We'd do them in 2 stages. So it would actually be that setting the stage process. We'd set that up as an initial, you know, lower cost investment by the jurisdiction to just figure out what the comp plan needs to cover, and then based on that, develop a budget for the whole comp plan rather than trying to guess right at the beginning what it's going to be. It's always going to change through the process, but you're kind of at a disadvantage when you don't at least try scope things out to make sure that you've got a process that's going to meet the needs of the community.
Yeah, I agree. And again, yeah, I've had that same experience, David, where again, just having a lot of that setting the stage work, you know, listening sessions, building your public engagement first. I mean, you know, you're going to be bringing in consultants, advisors, or whatever at some point. Oops, sorry about that, you guys. Turn that off. Yeah, so it's good to have it in mind, to have where you're going with the entire process. But I've been, I'll just throw out, I mean, one example, we started with just like a 4-month-long conversation with the community about, you know, the existing plan, how's it working, what new issues have come up. That was so rich that we went to the elected officials and said, let's keep that going. So we extended that upfront setting the stage portion another 4 months. So, and it paid off. By the time we were bringing consultants and so on into the process, it was quite efficient and much more streamlined.
Yeah, I'm not sure we answered the original question, but hopefully we helped a little bit. Something about, yeah, okay, but hopefully that helped.
I mean, and I could see, I sure, I mean, there's a lot of places that, oh, we're going to do a comp plan, let's get an RFQ or RFP out. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I like what you said, that this has to be adaptable to your context.
Okay, thank you. A couple more here. The approach that you're describing is very detailed and progressive, but how applicable is this to distressed rural communities that have scant capacity and appetite for both planning and implementation?
Mhm.
Rocky, you're nodding. You want to take a crack at that?
No, I was looking at you mulling. I was
Yeah. No.
thinking of that. Yeah, I mean, it can be difficult in those settings. And I'll just offer some. This may be may not be a direct square on answer, but you know, clearly, again, with this whole notion of knowing your context, knowing what has happened before, you know, there's kind of a echo, I think, in that question of you know, maybe being in a community that is suspicious of planning, doesn't embrace planning. And, you know, again, that's very important to recognize that, acknowledge it. It may well be the very first thing you need to do is figure out a way to develop a trust relationship going forward. So if the relationship in the past has been suspicious or, you know, somewhat questioning the value of it, you probably need to start with that. You know, how can you get the relationship of the community with the team involving the plan at a good point where everyone trusts each other, respects, doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's in agreement and is going to be on the same page, but that, again, you have that trust and respect for going forward. David,
Yeah.
you
Do I have time to add on a couple of things, Michael?
Sure.
Because I agree 100%, Rocky, with what you said, but I'm thinking back to my own experience here in Pennsylvania. Maybe this will add on to it a little bit. One was a rural county that I worked in, and I don't know how this would work nowadays with the political divide we have in this country, but it was similar to that from the eastern part of the county where there was a university, very progressive, to the western part, which was very, very conservative and rural. And it was interesting when we did that plan, we did a countywide survey. And even though there was like this divide in terms of, you know, kind of perspective, political perspectives, everyone in the survey, we were surprised, you know, they were all saying the same things. They all kind of wanted the same things. And that was a basis for consensus in developing the plan. So that was kind of interesting. So, you know, I think we didn't talk about surveys and how to reach people, but again, the ability at a local level to get people together and talk through issues, I think is one of the ways of addressing this. And I understand too about the capacity issue. And obviously, rural places don't have many have resources to do something like this. But another example from Pennsylvania, which has become my adopted home state, the Department of Community and Economic Development here developed a model they call the implementable comprehensive plan. And we talk about it in the book in the implementation chapter. But basically, it's a way of just getting to a few key things that a community can do and working. And they've done this process with really small, rather poor communities. It's been quite successful. So that's something you might want to take a look at. There's actually a book that was recently published by Denny Pucco and Jim Pashak that covers this. So, you know, there are approaches that this can work for rural communities. This doesn't have to be the full-blown Austin or Minneapolis comp plan. You just have to scale the scope of it down to what matches the community, and you know what's most important for the community to get out of it.
Yeah. I mean, meet the community where it's at, I think is part of the message. And I like what you said too about, you know, just there's a sense of scale. Just touching back to one of the questions that was posed before about, you know, kind of citizen-based planning in small towns. I think one of the most impressive efforts I ever saw was a community that just didn't have the resources, and it was a school teacher who, you know, had his summers off, who just said, you know, this is stuff I think we need to work on and address. And I mean, he became kind of the face of that effort and did a beautiful job. I mean, it was just very organic, bottom up there. And and was decent. And again, it was neighbors working with neighbors. Again, people had diverse thoughts and opinion, but there was this sense of respect in that process. And sometimes too, I mean, just look at how you may go about some things in a way that you can find a meeting point. So there was one community when I worked in Seattle, the regional plan there has policies that are formally adopted and then have to be reflected in local plans. So when we first introduced a body of growth management or of greenhouse gas and climate change policies, you know, I had one mayor who was supported by Tea Party elements in her community. And she came and said, you know, Rocky, I can't use the word climate change, you know, that, you know, I'll get voted out of office. But we had a rich discussion of what could happen, and we got there. I mean, we were able to talk about the community making a commitment to reduce its contributions of different air pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. I mean, we didn't have to use the C word to be successful in that setting.
Great. I'm going to ask you one last question before we wrap up today. And again, thanks everybody for submitting. We could easily have gone another hour with the Q&A. Here's the question here is, if you were advising state legislators that are considering updating its minimum standards for local comprehensive plans, what suggestions would you provide them on how the state should promote this new approach to local comprehensive planning?
Wow.
Wow, that's a big question to end on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually doing that now. I'm working.
Why don't you start?
I mean, we're working right now. We've had conversations with legislators, with different interest groups, and so on. I mean, Colorado has kind of taken a shot a couple of times at maturing its planning legislation, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. So we kind of have a movement in place right now. And I mean, drawing with a lot of what we're discussing here today. So, I mean, one is we're lifting up the value of articulating that 21st century challenges are interrelated and relate to each other. So, you know, let's create a planning framework that gets us away from incrementalism and siloed plan making to recognize these relationships. And that seems to have some traction. I mean, how successful will be the first shot with the state, I don't know. But I also had experience with Washington State when we first overhauled the planning legislation there back in the 90s. And, you know, part of it is just, again, getting rich information out on the challenges. I mean, some of it may be shock and awe if we don't do something that's much more comprehensive and sustainable and equitable. But again, I mean, I always say, you know, I think the first and foremost job of a planner is to provide elected officials with the best information possible. So there's plenty of examples. I mean, there's a spectrum across the country. If you're working with your particular state, that maybe there's some parallels back in Washington. Our parallel at that time was Georgia, you know, on the total opposite end of the country, but they were doing some things that were intriguing, that were different from what was happening in Oregon, that Washingtonians were a little bit more familiar with and suspicious of. So yeah, David, I'll let you off.
Yeah, I recoiled from that question for a minute, because it took me aback because I'm actually in Pennsylvania and I'm on the volunteer member of the APAPA chapter legislative committee, and there is a municipalities planning code. And I'll put this delicately, the Pennsylvania state legislature is not known for being progressive. So part of our strategy and approach is let's not like try to get into significant NPC changes. So we're mainly actually dealing with legislative proposals that come up. But having said that, I mean, there are issues and things that resonate with legislators. So you basically got to find stories and talk with
Yes.
things, the issues that will resonate with them. I wouldn't carry my flag up to Harrisburg in Pennsylvania and say, we've got to require that comprehensive plans address climate change.
Yeah.
But
No.
maybe you could do things like, everyone realizes there's floods, et cetera, without talking about what's causing them. Like, are there ways that we could, maybe it's voluntary elements or something rather than mandatory, but changes that we can make to promote some of these things to address issues that legislators,
Yeah.
constituents are experiencing impact. If we had terrible flooding, I don't think people even across the country even kind of realize this necessarily from Hurricane Ida. It killed outside Philadelphia and up in boroughs like Bridgeport, killed people. People are still homeless. They can't find places to live, and because the housing market's so expensive. So these impacts are being felt. So I think Rocky, you might have said it's elevating. The comprehensive plan can be a way of dealing with these and can set the direction. It has so much potential. So maybe it's just starting by talking to legislators about the role of the comp plan and how it can address issues that they're concerned about and their constituents are concerned about.
So follow up with us. So this symposium I'm talking about here in Colorado is taking place in June. And I love David. I mean, we decided we're not going to bring in talking heads and experts from states where they made that shift and so on. We're going to start with storytelling. So I love that you mentioned that. Let's just have a conversation there, roundtables, have electeds there, hear people's stories, and again, talk about the fact that business as usual is not going to carry us into the future. So what is it we could do to ensure we have a more successful and vibrant future for everyone in the state? So
Great, thanks, Rocky. And thanks for both of you for covering a lot of ground today. I guess we'll close here and I'll give each of you a chance to give us some kind of closing thoughts and takeaways. We'll go back to you, Rocky.
Okay, well, cool. Yeah, delighted to be with you. I mean, it tickles me. I feel humbled to see just how extensive the participation was on this. I think, again, a lot of our message is simple, that things in the 21st century are much more challenging, much more complex. They don't lend themselves to a lot of how we approach planning in the much of the 20th century, where we just allowed it to be kind of single issue and siloed. That again, bringing in systems thinking, one of the points David mentioned there in terms of the future of the comprehensive plan, I think it is critical. I think it's easy for people to recognize and understand. I mean, it obviously brings in a complexity, but it's a path forward, I think, to be much more successful. And I totally embrace what David said earlier here, that, I mean, I think the comprehensive plan can just be a rich, amazing tool and encourage every community to really look at how they can really make it their roadmap, their guide for a much better future for their communities.
Yeah, picking up on Rocky's point, we do use this analogy in the book. I think in the last chapter we compare a comprehensive planning process, a good one, as a journey taken collectively by a community in search of a better future. So thinking about it that way, I think the potential is we're planners, so we tend to be optimistic. It's hard to nowadays, but still the potential of the comprehensive plan, I really think past comprehensive plans are barely scratching the surface of what it could be in the future, and how, and the role of planners in planning and advancing the future of communities. And that's a large reason I think Rocky and I wrote this book, because what we're hoping is going to inspire creativity. It's going to inspire research. There's very little research out there on comprehensive plans. There's some good research that's been done. Dave Gottschalk has done some, Phil Burke and others, but this whole collection of contemporary plans that we collected in this book, no one's really done research. So what would be great, for example, would be the research. Okay, this such jurisdiction to this comprehensive plan, or maybe a set of them, what actually got implemented? What impact does that have? We don't know. You know, at one point I was asked a question when I was research director. An old colleague called me up and said, "Hey, David, I'm meeting the mayor tomorrow. I'm sure APA has some research on how comprehensive plans like build the economy or something. you have something you could. I need something to tell the mayor." And I said, "Well, actually, I haven't done that research." So that would be another thing I would add. Well, two things: first, potential, and then second, I hope this inspires both creativity in terms of applications and practice at the local level, but hopefully planning scholars to do research on the comprehensive plan at a new, different level, just to rise to this rise to the level of addressing the challenges we face. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Well said, David. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks both of you. And I'll just remind the audience that we sent this out in the chat. David was here previously on his PROACT Now approach, and that webinar is available for viewing on smartgrowth.org and on YouTube on the Smart Growth online channel. As well, there were a lot of questions about community involvement, and we have a number of programs there as well in the archives. So with that, we're going to conclude our webinar today, the Comprehensive Plan, Sustainable, Resilient, and Equitable Communities for the 21st Century. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to David Rouse and Rocky Piro for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including effective conservation, parks rewilding, and local development on March 31st. And I think that notification just went out. American Urbanist, How William H. White Reshaped Public Life, which will occur on April 7th. And finally, Right of Way, Addressing the Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America with Angie Schmidt, which will hold on April 12th. With that, I wish everybody a great day.